Welcome to everyone. My name is Teresa Blumenstein. I am the New York coordinator for the Justice Coalition of Religious, which is comprised of 19 NGOs that represent Catholic or congregations of sisters, brothers, and fathers at the United Nations headquarters. And I was part of the team that collaborated, that was comprised of other representatives of NGOs representing Catholic religious congregations to draft the statement that we are gathered to launch here today, which is a faith-based vision for the UN at 75 and beyond. And in this capacity, I am extremely pleased to welcome you to the launch of the document, which has received 67 organizational signatures and counting as of right now. And we have the tremendous privilege of being joined today by Dr. Azza Karam, the Secretary General of Religions for Peace International, as well as Mr. Joop Theunissen, the Deputy Chief of Intergovernmental Policy and Review Branch of the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs. So I thank you both for taking the time not only to review our somewhat lengthy document, but also to generously offer your responses to lead off our discussion today. I also, looking around, of course, I see many on the call have had some hand in drafting or editing the statement to get it to its final state. And I suspect a few others have already spent time delving into its contents. And during the later portion of today's gathering, we look forward to hearing thoughts from anyone who is eager to share, to get your responses to the juicy food for thought that I'm sure that Dr. Karam and Joop will be providing us. But until that time, I will ask everyone to be vigilant about keeping your microphones on mute, and then we can optimize our sound quality and experience for everyone gathered. And I also want to note that we are recording today's session. For the benefit of anyone who has not already familiarized themselves with the statement that we're launching today, I will begin by offering a bit of background on the statement and its central points. Although if you even take a glance at it, you'll see that there's a lot more there than I will trouble you with summarizing right now. But I do want to make a few important points. As the title indicates, the faith-based vision for the UN at 75 and beyond was drafted in preparation for the UN's 75th anniversary of the founding of the organization. And this anniversary marks a critical inflection point for the UN as an institution. And incidentally, it happens to come at a period of global health crisis that demands global reflection on errors of the past and discernment of pathways to a future in which global governance and community are able to navigate us around avoidable harm and make us more resilient to harms that cannot be avoided. Though this document presents many specific courses of action in its text that might contribute to our arrival at this future that we envision, it does organize those suggestions under 4 overarching recommendations. And so I will just mention those briefly to have us set that in as our framework for our discussion. And the recommendations are as follows, and I'll bring them up on the screen briefly for those who are more visual learners, want to be able to take it in. Just one moment. Okay, so the 4 overarching points that are included in this document. First, make the role of civil society, including FBOs, which is our shorthand for faith-based organizations, in UN processes more central and meaningful. Secondly, reform the Security Council structure and scope of work to reflect a modern, community-focused understanding of security and the UN's championship of democracy. Number 3, develop a UN body dedicated to the coordination of both the internal or UN institution-wide and national level reviews of implementation of UN treaties, declarations, resolutions, and compacts. And finally, number 4, scale up technology capacity, affordability, and accessibility, and revise the logistical approach of UN processes to allow remote participation to become a primary mode of operation. And just one more point I want to add before we get into our rich discussion is to revisit a point I made a moment ago about the team that drafted and edited this document. The group was comprised of Catholic sisters, priests, and laypersons who represent Catholic religious congregations at the UN. And as such, we endeavored to apply broad lessons and key insights that Catholic religious congregations have gained throughout the course of their long histories as both first responders and long-term community pillars among the most marginalized peoples of the world, along with their institutional wisdom as global, geographically borderless organizations who throughout history have had to recognize and recourse on their own missteps along the way. We want to acknowledge that the drafting team hardly reflects the diversity of the rich tapestry of faith-based organizations who are accredited at the United Nations, let alone the broader global community of faith-based organizations. And this statement does not intend to speak on behalf of that vast and rich community. Even a cursory reading of the document reveals the Catholic and Christian roots of its drafters through allusions to Christian scripture and terminology pulled directly from Catholic social teaching. Nevertheless, it was clear in the drafting process that the perspectives on UN reforms and progress we were presenting and the values from which they emerge were not ours alone. It was with this understanding that we entitled the document Faith-Based Vision. And it's with that same spirit that we are inviting organizations with roots in all faith backgrounds to become co-signatories, to its message. As we know from decades of participation in UN fora, and anyone on this call could attest, our message is certainly strengthened when we are able to speak in unison. And now that I've done quite enough talking, I am very eager to hear what responses to the faith-based vision our discussants have to share. But that being said, because this is a faith-based document that we're launching, and it is faith that brings us together today, and because our circumstances preclude our gathering in person, I will delay our discussants' comments just one more moment and humbly invite everyone who's on the call to close your eyes if you wish and to join one another in a moment of spiritual connection. Let us share a breath to bless our own faith traditions, the special language and narratives through which they are communicating truth from one generation to the next, the unique rituals through which they celebrate and foster our relationship with the divine. Let us share a breath to bless this common space to which these unique languages, narratives, and rituals have led us. Our shared values, our joint commitment to the construction of a world that is just and peaceful, our dependence on one another and on the health and generosity of the earth. Let us take a breath, take in the names and faces of all gathered here, and share a breath to bless one another, recognizing the innate goodness, the personal vocations, and the unrepeatable gifts and perspectives each one brings to our human family and to today's conversation. And in the spirit of connection and openness, it is my distinct honor to introduce our first discussant, Dr. Azza Karam. Professor Karam has served in different positions within intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations for nearly 30 years, and within the United Nations since 2004. Throughout this period, she has lectured in various academic institutions throughout Europe, North America, Africa, and the Middle East. Prior to taking up her current post as Secretary General of Religions for Peace International, Dr. Karam served as a senior advisor on culture at the United Nations Population Fund and as chair of the United Nations Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development. She is also currently the lead facilitator for the United Nations Strategic Learning Exchanges on Religion, Development, and Diplomacy. As her resume suggests, she is not only a scholar and a leader, but also a dear and dedicated friend to faith-based organizations at the UN and beyond. We are remarkably blessed to have her with us today. So with that, Dr. Karam, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Teresa, for that absolutely lovely introduction. I wish I had, oh, actually it's recorded, good. I think I'm going to copy and paste in different contexts. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to you. And it's truly I who feel blessed to be able to be with you today, in this afternoon in this conversation, and to be part of this particular discussion. So thank you very much for making that possible and for finding me worthy to share this space with you. Quick couple of comments, if I may, because I want to talk about this for the rest of my life. I think it's such, I'm so excited and so happy and so delighted with this. The fact that there is this voice of faith making itself eloquently, articulately heard about how it owns the United Nations as an entity, as a means, I mean, I think that's, given everything that's going on in the world around us today, quite frankly, and the moment in which we live, which has been a rather long moment, of multilateralism in general being at its lowest possible ebb since we last ended the League of Nations. I think we're pretty much at that same space now in terms of just a thorough sense of disillusionment, certainly deliberate marginalization of the United Nations system, deliberate marginalization by certain governments, but also by, let's face it, by a lot of civil society groups who may not be, who have certain positions and perspectives on the value added of such an entity, but by and large by a number of governments who are part of a process that we're seeing happening around us, which is quite frankly, and I can say this now that I'm not in the UN anymore, which is quite frankly, thugs rule. And sometimes those particular regimes are also elected by people. So we are in that really, really difficult time in history when there's so much polarization between citizens and among citizens, between citizens and migrants and refugees and displaced peoples, and the highest number of such ever that are more than populations of certain nations. And at this moment where a number of political regimes feel that really it is might makes right and my way or the highway. And I think this is precisely, these are so many factors in a climate in which the very air we breathe can burn our lungs, and the pandemic, which is pretty much burning our lungs. So quite frankly, if the divine wanted to give us a whole set of messages, they could not be more deftly packaged to say danger, 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 and danger especially to our multilateral institutions created to do what? Created to uphold human rights, created to ensure that we would not fight with one another again. the quote from Isaiah that's right in front of the UN across the road here is, it makes me want to cry every time I pass by it. And look how many wars, a nation will not go, look how many wars we are living in the midst of today, inside nations and between and betwixt nations. So if we could have, in a nightmare scenario, tried to craft the ways in which our United Nations system, i.e. the system that upholds the moral values, the rule of law, the international human rights law, international humanitarian law, the system that upholds all that is our values together, is at its most threatened. It could not have been a more perfect package of situations, quite frankly. I'm probably forgetting a few things here and there, but I figure I've pretty much sketched the really difficult things out there. So we are living in a moment when all we know that we have created after tremendous, tremendous pain of 2 world wars after the other, all that we have created to try to safeguard us is actually threatened and in many cases being deliberately ignored completely. Is this really a right time for the voices of those who own, who live, who breathe the traditions from which the values the United Nations system today derives and stands on? Is this the right time for these traditions to come together in spite of their differences, across their differences, in the spirit of the spirit, and actually say, here is how we can, we must, we need this multilateral system to function? Of course, it's the right moment. My goodness me, if it wasn't now, what else is it going to take? Good grief, what else is it going to take? So this is the right moment, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is predicated upon the principles, the values shared by all faith traditions. Literally, by all faith traditions. It is the best of that which unites us and brings us together. It is the best of the divine message in all its forms. This is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It came out of that basis. So now the basis, the foundation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the foundation of the United Nations system, the foundation speaks. Because the pain, the pressure, the tearing apart is intense. The foundation speaks. In your voices, I hear the articulation, the constructive articulation, the hopeful articulation, the very guided, simple, streamed. It's not just about us coming together and saying kumbaya. This is about us saying, you need to change this, you need to talk about that, you need to reflect on this, here's what we need to see happen here. It is clear, respectful guidance for how to keep the foundation and keep this building rock solid for all of us, because we all need it. So I think in terms of that as an initiative, I cannot be more joyful. And to me, reading this document, quite frankly, is an act of grace. I see the production of this document as an act of divine grace. And I'm deeply grateful to everybody who contributed to this, because this is what grace looks like when we're trying to salvage our current contemporary world. So, do I love the document? Yes, I think it's pretty clear that I do. I think the second thing I wanted to say, though, to be honest, every single one of those recommendations is a recommendations for the member states of the United Nations. Because at the end of the day, this is a structure created and designed to serve the space that is owned by the member states, 193 member states of the system. That's what makes it remarkable. I mean, can we here invite the US government in its entirety to come to and meet with us? Can we ever do that? The day we succeed in doing that will be a remarkable day. I hope it never happens, because then it must mean that there's a catastrophe. But see how difficult it is to combine one government, and imagine then 193 coming together, and they have an entity called the United Nations. So frankly, change begins and ends in the UN system with and by governments, because they own this. This is their space. And I learned to appreciate that while I worked in the UN, and Joop can speak much better to this now. But I learned to appreciate that when I moved here to Religions for Peace, which is the space owned by religious tradition, literally. So I realized, wait a minute, I don't have traditions. Each of them religious, each of them long established, much longer than the UN. right? Each of them age-old, literally centuries-old religious institutions. So I'm sorry, when you want me to change something, I'm going to have to go to that body of 100 and say, so, how about it? Do you think we might possibly consider this, that, and everywhere? And that is really what we need to do. So the faith-based voice is noteworthy in the fact that you were able to come together, that you determined how to speak and what to say, and that you made that presentation. Our challenge is in making sure we are supposed to be able to elect those governments, to hold them accountable. Any weakness you see in this UN system reflects directly on each of the 193 governments. It is a weakness of the governments themselves. It isn't a coincidence that we are living in such polarized times in the United States of America when the United Nations is that diverse, is that hurt, because those representing this member state are representing a situation of polarization inside this body. And look how many governments today are suffering that. So the UN reflects the weakness of the governments. It reflects their strength, it reflects their weakness. So one thing about the directionality, because I think by coming to this point where you can actually articulate what the faith-based voice is and wants and sees, the next step is to direct it correctly. And it needs to be directed to the member states of the United Nations. Because I know full well that Joop and myself can't change anything. When I was in the UN, there was there's very little that you can actually change in terms of the UN infrastructure. But I do know that the governments who are the members of the UN system are the ones who are literally making those decisions. And guess what? It's not all 193 governments, and that's part of what you're saying. In the report, it's very, very clear. We want to reform the Security Council. Why? Because the Security Council doesn't represent the whole 193 governments, does it? It represents a very, very old world order. And it's now become a problem in terms of administering what the UN system needs. So you're asking for that kind of a reform. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That needs to be directed to the member states, because that is your voice to those who are making the decisions, actually, right? So my point is brilliant. Now direction. We need to be stewards of this process. The voice has come. You have stewarded the voice. That's brilliant. And that's an act of grace. Now we must continue in making sure that the direction of this is the right direction, because otherwise it'll be extremely frustrating. Here we are, we've gone to all this trouble, we've presented, nothing is changing. Well, no, because we haven't directed it to the right place. So this process that you think you have completed is but the beginning. It is but the beginning. Yes, it was an achievement on the 75th anniversary. Now we begin the journey of making sure that this comes to the attention of each member state. And here is the faith-based voice. And then the last thing I want to say, and I promise, is one of the things that I loved about your recommendations, and I was like, finally, thank you, God. You mentioned civil society, including faith-based organizations. Seriously, hallelujah. Hallelujah. Because one of the struggles that we had, those of us who worked in religion in the UN for all these years, one of the struggles was having to have a conversation with an average faith-based organization, by the way, usually Catholic, but a couple of Muslims too, who were so convinced of their exceptionalism. Of course they're exceptional. Of course, every single religious entity is, of course the Vatican is exceptional. But the point is, you can't go to the UN and say, I'm exceptional. Please understand that I'm exceptional, and then treat me different from the way you treat others. The strength of the faith voices is in its multi-religious nature, one, and in its ability to be part of the civic fabric of each and every society. Not to create a silo, a claim to exclusion that positions you outside of the civic space. The civic space is tortured. Our civic space globally is a tortured space. We don't need more claims to difference and exceptionalism in it. Part of us are so thrilled with the Black Lives Matter movement. Why? For many reasons. One of which is the fact that it's bringing people together across the differences. It's making the call of pain, articulating it together, and therefore it becomes a call of strength. And that's exactly what the faith movements around the world have to do. They have to come together, first of all, across the different religious differences, which are, if anybody knew how to do difference, it's religions. So they're coming together across the religious differences. Brilliant. God is there. This is grace. Now, the point is, you see that this is part of the civic infrastructure, the civic fabric. Even before this whole pandemic, we were complaining about the fact that civil society is being seriously hurt. It's under stress. We're worried about civil society from north to south, east to west. So when you make your call, as you did, as part of civil society, you are embracing the civic space and serving it. And that's precisely what I believe God ordained us to do, to be of service to all his creation. And it is civil society, in my humble opinion, that will ultimately save the United Nations system. Because if we keep depending on the governments, it might take a wee while longer, and it might be going south before it goes anywhere else first, right? So let's at least show respect for the civic infrastructure that we belong to, that we are part of, that ultimately needs to hold these governments responsible. And it is when we can hold our governments responsible that we can then change the United Nations system. And that's the sequence of events. So congratulations on bringing it this far. Bless you, each and all, for what you have done, because what you have done is a movement, is a testament to the divine nature and to what we are supposed to do on this earth. Now let's make sure we target this correctly. We have just begun the journey. Let's target this to the member states themselves. All the foreign ministries should receive this. All ministries of foreign affairs, state departments in this country should receive this. And then continue to build the bridges with other civil society members, because this is a movement of civil society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, as always, Dr. Karam, for your very enthusiastic response. Your cheerleading, although it's hardly valid or strong enough to say cheerleading, is more like coaching, I would say, of faith-based organizations and us as a community. Honestly, you're always such a source of energy and encouragement that we always need, because as you mentioned at the top of your statement, the challenges we're facing are tremendous right now. And while that's always been the case, they seem particularly intense and multiplying on one another at this moment. And so that encouragement, as well as the concrete guidance, is certainly taken to heart. And we hope to be in continued conversation with you to see how that redirecting of these comments, of this voice, in all the effective directions we can think of. We hope to continue to seek your counsel in making sure that we can make the most of the effort put forth thus far. And I would now like to move into introduce our second discussant for the day, who is Mr. Joop Theunissen. Mr. Theunissen has been a United Nations staff member for nearly 30 years. He started his work in the regional office of the UN for Asia and Pacific in Bangkok in the 1990s. Since 1999, he has been based in New York, holding various positions within the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, which many of us know fondly, of course, as UN-DESA. Throughout his career, Mr. Theunissen has worked on social development issues, including the UN Program on Youth and on the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. He has served as the Deputy Chief of UN-DESA's NGO branch for 5 years. And since 2014, he has been working as the Deputy Chief in the branch of DESA responsible for organizing the HLPF, or High Level Political Forum, for those joining us from outside the UN sphere. Also responsible for reviewing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and for providing support to the second committee of the UN General Assembly, which is the segment of the General Assembly that deals with global finance and economic matters. Mr. Theunissen, thank you so much for joining us. The microphone is yours.
Yes, please say Joop. Mr. Theunissen must be my late dad, or a brother that I did not have. I only had a sister. Anyway, so it's Joop from now on. Thank you all, and thank you, Teresa, for having me, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you also to my sister Azza. I haven't seen her for a long time. I've had the pleasure of working with her in the past, and I will be practical in nature. I actually have reviewed this document in much detail. I have quite a few things to say about it from a practical perspective, because I think that's really what you were looking for, and I think, you know, may be helpful in moving forward. But just a few words from on a philosophical nature, if you allow me. We had an internal staff meeting earlier this afternoon, and we had been reviewing the progress in coming together physically at the UN building over the next few months. And somebody said it's going to be a long winter, meaning that very few of us will have an opportunity to actually enter the building that we love so much, that we spend a lot of time in, to interact with delegates and emphasize the things that we feel are important with them, and work on our common goals, which is what we do at the UN. But then in the end, I realized, yeah, sure, it may be a long winter, but there will also be a spring that will follow the winter. And I think working for the UN, you have to be an eternally optimistic person, knowing that spring will come. Very practically speaking, I think we will come to an end of the COVID pandemic sometime. Nobody knows when, sooner, hopefully tomorrow. Otherwise, the day after tomorrow or soon after that, but it will come. I'm convinced of that. And secondly, I am also convinced that the climate for multilateralism will improve. Not tomorrow, maybe November, maybe January, maybe later than that, but it will improve. So it is in that optimistic mindset that our winter may not be so long. So, and it is also with that mindset that I've been reviewing this paper, because the paper says UN at 75 and beyond. You know, we have come quite a long way with this organization, with this global experiment called the United Nations. And there's been many errors, and there's been quite a few achievements. But what has never really left the organization, at least not entirely, is the ambition and the vision for a better, fairer future. And that is why it is good that a faith-based vision is being put together. Because actually, if you look at the word vision, it is a reflection of what the UN has tried to achieve as a collective of 193 member states in 2015. It's called the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you ask for a global vision of how the world should look like in the future, the UN's best, not perfect, but a fairly good answer is, well, we have 17 SDGs, and that's basically a description of how we think collectively, as all the member states of the world together, the future should look like. And that is something that we are working towards. So there, I see a parallel with many of the greatest faiths of the world, including the Catholic tradition that I come from myself and that you represent here. And that is wonderful. So that it gives us a really strong guidance for the future, not just for next week when the 75th anniversary is observed, but also for the next 10 years until 2030. And I'm convinced for the years after, when we need such a vision even more than we do now. So I think in the vision department, we are really firmly established. Your organizations have a clear vision. The UN has a clear vision. And with the UN, I mean, not just the member states who come to sign that document, DA Resolution 70/1 in 2015 called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, but also we in the Secretariat who actually need to make sure that this vision is implemented somewhere. So there's a very strong parallel between FBOs and the UN in norm setting. Of course, and there's also a very strong parallel in the delivery and implementation. And as this paper indicates, and as Teresa has mentioned, you know, many of your organizations come from a very old and respected tradition of caring and being part of communities that need it, of justice in all forms. And this is, from that point of view, UN is really a baby. It's only 75 years old. We are basically just newcomers. We're really the new kid down the block. So I think the UN should, from that perspective, respect this vision and treat it as such. And I'm not sure exactly what you will be doing with this document and how you will submit it or share it, but that is something that that you can say, you know, hey, listen to us. We've been around and we've done this. We come from traditions that have provided before and that have cared before. So what we are putting in this document is valuable. Anyway, so with that in mind, you know, I've just gone through some scribbles in this document, and it's perhaps a little bit pedestrian, but I will just go through it page by page. Now, as Teresa mentioned, there are 4 elements there to this document. The second one on the reform of the Security Council, I agree, but I work in economic and social development, so I'm not really at the privilege to speak about that. Also because I don't really know, and obviously I read the newspaper like you, and I speak to colleagues like you, and I think they're all good ideas, but I can't really relate to it professionally. Now, so just on this first point, as I mentioned already, role of civil society in UN processes should be more should be more central and meaningful. I have many thoughts on this, contradicting thoughts, because you see, first of all, from a very harsh perspective, and I've been wondering about this many times, I have wondered sometimes, why does civil society want to come to the UN when it is so imperfect? Why do you choose to come to the UN every day, every week, every month, or every Commission for Social Development, or every HRPF, or every Security Council briefing? Why? There's a supply and demand function here. If we are not delivering a product that is satisfying, I wonder why people are still buying our product. You know, I studied economics, so that probably explains. And so I'm very grateful that there are many segments in civil society, including this particular group, that still believes that it is meaningful to make civil society more central in the UN, because, you know, apparently there's still value in reaching out to the UN. And I say this as a big philosophical point, but I also say this from a very practical viewpoint. I say that when I see at the HRPF at 5 o'clock that people are waiting very patiently to be given their 3 minutes when very few delegates are still in the room. And that is fantastic. And that is necessary. I think that's my conclusion. Even though I have these thoughts and they're cynical and harsh and based on economics, at the end of the day, there are people that make the UN, individuals and individual organizations, faith-based organizations, that make the UN better because they are there at 5 o'clock and at 6:30 if they must, or later even, all right? Now, so from that perspective, I see somewhere on page 2 that space for FBOs, participation negotiations, as it is for other NGOs, remains tokenistic. And that is a fact, a naked fact. They perhaps have become even more tokenistic. And yes, I think the space for participation of civil society in the UN has shrunk somewhat in the last 5 to 7 or perhaps 10 years. The governments that we have in the House are not as open to civil society participation as they were 10 years ago. They are not as keen to listen. And I don't know what we can do about it except for diplomacy and reminding them of the need to listen to faith-based organizations and to other NGOs. But I think it requires a stronger response from civil society. Now, on the other hand, I also see, and here comes my economist background again in this section, that I see all these proposals on page 3, recognizing NGO committees, support meaningful inclusion. Here comes my hard self comes back again. And I ask you, do you really want to be in every informal consultation that the second committee is going to have between now and November, when we are going to negotiate 40 resolutions, many of them including 90% repetitive language? So as a shopper, and I hate to use that word, but as a faith-based, as an NGO, you come to the UN and you see a big sign and you can choose where you go. So in a way, and some people do that, you can shop for a meeting that you think that your contribution can be meaningful. So what I have seen in my own career and working with your organizations is that, and not always is a very strong priority setting of the NGO community into what you want to get out of the UN. Because there's so many things that are going on in our building, a little bit of prioritization will help. And then just to end on part 1, and I will skip part 2, so I will not be speaking that long anymore. The last bullet of part 1, create a major stakeholder group for FBOs. Please do this within the next 6 months, because you can. Because this major groups mechanism is something that comes out of the Rio conference from 1992, has been undergoing many different reiterations, but is alive and is effective and a powerful voice. There were originally 9 major groups and other stakeholders as constructed in the Rio conference. Now we have 17 or 18, including the group of stakeholders, Sendai working group of people who are engaged in disaster risk and rehabilitation. There's an LGBT group. There's a volunteer group. I've been waiting for the FBO group for quite some time. And I wonder why that has not happened. It really, there's even an Asia Pacific group now, not an Africa or Latin America group, I don't know why, but an Asia Pacific group of organizations, many grassroots from South Asia and from Southeast Asia have come up, and they took a seat at the table. And I know that that is an influential group because they get seats assigned to speak in the HLPF. So if there's one practical thing that from this paper that I would put my big check mark after, it would be that one. And I would really encourage you to make use of that opportunity. So again, skipping the peripheral issue of the security council in this paper, I was struggling a little bit with part 3 on the development of a UN body to coordinate the national reviews of the various treaties and agreements. Now, I know that the UN is very good in norm setting and not so good in following up on all these norms. If that's what you mean, everyone will agree. But if we show this part to a diplomat, a cynical diplomat, you say, well, are we creating an extra entity here, or a CPC, or a, what are they, the 5th committee, subsidiary body? And I guess that's not what we want, but reading this, that's the impression that is what you are calling for, and maybe I'm wrong. So I would be a little bit careful, but there are very good practical. So maybe the header should be a little bit rewritten. I mean, can be rewritten, because the content is actually very practical. Applying the principle of gender equity, absolutely agreed. All these bullets under environmental sustainability, all very good. So maybe you can phrase it a little different, but the practical proposals there are very good. And then finally on technology and access, the 4th point. And of course we have learned a lot from the last 6 months about, let's just talk about UN now as an intergovernmental body sitting in New York. I mean, there's many other UNs sitting in many other countries and many, you know, in the programming and delivery. I'm not speaking here of all the challenges that our colleagues in humanitarian or peacekeeping operations have. I'm just speaking here of the UN headquarters and the building and the meetings that are taking place in the building and the two options that you have about the virtual versus in person. Now, the trick will be in the months ahead, because you see, we're now 6 months into this. Hopefully we will not, but likely we will complete the first cycle of a full year of not being able to function in the previous, like we did in the previous 74 years. And having worked on the HRPF, which was entirely virtual, and having now contributed to the preparation of a General Assembly that starts next week and then in October onwards, I think the sweet spot will be in making best use of the positives and trying to find ways to address the negatives. Now, obviously, the positives of being virtual, and we've seen that in the numbers of attendance at the HRPF, is that for some reason the level of participation, at least passive participation, is much better. We had hundreds and actually sometimes thousands more people attending the HRPF for the simple reason it was all available online. And we were also lucky, maybe not lucky, but we did a good job, I guess. My colleagues did a good job in making sure that we had as many side events to the HRPF as before. Actually, it was hard to make a distinction between a side event and an official event, because everything is happening on this little screen here in front of us, the same screen that we're sitting now. So if you sit somewhere and you're not involved in the work of the UN on a daily basis, you look for what is there, and you don't have to scramble into conference room A and get a secondary pass for conference room C. You can just switch it on, and if you don't like it, you switch it off. You go to conference room B, and that is a big plus. That shows that there is much more interaction now because we're all sitting on that screen. Okay, so that is a plus. The other plus, and those of you who come to the UN on a regular basis will agree with me, is well, this actually is a minus, the in-person contact. That is, of course, difficult. You know, this morning we had delegations speak about how we are going to address these 40 resolutions in the second committee. Are we going to have just a technical rollover, or are we going to include additional paragraphs or not? And the way that this meeting was held with these fairly junior delegates was to say, well, let's just pretend that we are in the Vienna Cafe now, that we are actually in the delegates lounge, that we can speak freely. So they decided to speak to each other on first name basis, and we're basically recreating a physical meeting. But that is a negative, because we can do this for this cycle, but not next cycle, because then the US delegate has been replaced, hopefully, or the Dutch delegate has been replaced, and then we don't know, we are not on first name basis anymore. So that has to be solved, and there's really no way that we can continue to do this in the years ahead. So that we need to address. And every one of us are missing, I miss the large events at the UN that allow people to interact and to network. CSW, HRPF, the UN General Assembly, Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the Conference of States Parties for People with Disabilities. I could go on, the Human Rights Council in Geneva. That is something that is slowly evaporating, and if you will. And that is something that we need to get back on track quickly, because networking is important for NGOs. Networking is important to continue to hammer on important issues that are related to them. And also, and I say this with hesitation, but it seems that technology does not help people to agree. We have no outcome of the high-level political forum. Everything was negotiated for months. Since March, we had a first draft, 2 pages, group comes over, 6 pages, 5 pages. foreign occupation, climate reference. I mean, these are not secret issues. These are things that keep coming up. And we just could not get the people in the room to agree on that. And if so, I think that little screen is not just our friend, but it's also a little bit our enemy. And so when you say in part 4 that, and you put it in bold on page 9, we therefore urge the UN to make significant investment in technological capacity and infrastructure. And I understand that at other offices you need that. But here we have had a situation the past few months, and this is just my preliminary assessment, if you will, or thought, is that yes, we do have the technology in place now. We've gone through these teething problems with getting the interpretation right, and on the platform, this and that. But we need to learn how to use this technology. And so what I saw this morning is that when these delegates say, okay, let's now pretend, okay, let's roll up our sleeves and pretend that we're in the delegates lounge. I think that pretending part is still missing. And because it is it's not how people engage, and this is not really how people are used to engage. Maybe at the end it becomes more efficient. I don't know, but I would personally prefer to go to the building, and sit and speak to people and groups of people that have, their own internal processes on how to come to agreement on a position, and then communicate this in a formal way in the building. So on balance, I think, technology is important, but there are dangers to it. And there's some signs that technology is not helping international agreements over the last 6 months. None of our heads of state have met in person over the last 6 months. For some, they probably prefer this way, but I think it is necessary. The GA hall, and I say this with sadness, will be empty next week. There'll be a few people speaking, but that's not a nice anniversary to have. Okay, so I'm not going to say it's going to be a long winter. It's going to be a beautiful spring, but we will just need to be patient, and we will need to persist. And speaking of persistence, I hope you will submit this to powerful people in the building, or should be in the building, next week, as a beautiful 75th birthday present from a tradition who's been there much longer. And consider, hey, UN, you're still a young organization, still quite a few things to learn. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Joop, for sharing those insights in great detail and taking the time to really work your way through that and think about it critically. The investment of time is so evident, and your points are well taken, even just on the last section there. I think so many of us are long practiced. I mean, another wisdom from faith-based traditions is, of course, nothing beats in-person relationship building. And any way that we would advocate for moving forward, while, as you say, there are so many gifts that can arise from accessibility when it comes to technology. We'll have to be careful in the way that we navigate it, because certainly nothing can replace human contact, and we know that well. And as for your, I'll say, statement of inspiration, that civil society continues to show up despite the flawed product, the flawed product that the UN is producing. I would say faith traditions also kind of give us an approach of very much understanding that there's a lot of love available and a lot of value available for things, people, creatures that are imperfect. And so that's part of kind of what inspires this extremely long-term work and the cultivation of eternal hope, despite doubts in the foreground. So thank you again for your comments and your careful examination of the documents. And we very much intend to share this as widely as we can. But with that, I want to open the floor to our other participants who are gathered here today, many of whom have been intimately involved in the drafting process. and who have taken lots of time to examine the document themselves. So I will now open the floor. If anyone would like to, it's a fairly small crowd, so I'll say if you'd like to, just go ahead and unmute yourself and share your question or your comment or perhaps response to Dr. Karam or Joop.
I guess we were both so crystal clear that there's everybody agrees with everything you said. It's all good.
I do see one hand raised. Despina, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please go ahead.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you to both our discussants for these great points that they raised. And we really appreciate their time and their wisdom. I have a question to you. Why do you think the member states are no longer willing to listen to the civil society and to the faith-based organizations?
No, sorry. You want me to answer, Teresa?
Yeah.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah.
You
No,
can both
it's-
each take a
sorry.
turn.
It's a big world. It's a big world, and there's variation and there's nuance. There's many governments who want to listen to civil society and actually invite civil society. But there's some who are not interested in the UN to listen to civil society because they don't feel that they are part of the UN construct. The United Nations is the United Nations. It's not the United NGOs. It's a member state organization. And the only way, and I'm not speaking just legally, the only way that civil society can have a say in the construct of the UN is through consultative status with ECOSOC. That's what the charter is saying. That in Article 71, the United Nations was created, as we know, Article 1, created for member states that don't want war anymore and want peace and development and justice. And NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are invited to get consultative status with the Economic and Social Council. The charter of the UN has not dramatically changed. Many member states, some more than others, feel that sure, there's civil society, it's powerful, there's business interests, there's all kinds of other groups that are important, but the United Nations is the United Nations. And therefore, there's a limited space for civil society to begin with. This is perhaps an antiquated view, but it is the view that is still prevalent with quite a few member states. That's how it is. Sad, good or bad, but they want to speak with each other and not with civil society. They don't come to the UN to listen to an NGO. Sorry, it's a very harsh way of putting it, perhaps, but yeah, that's my answer. Sorry, Azza.
No, please don't be sorry. I'm quite happy to hear the Dutchman say it like it is. Couple of points, maybe just to nuance a little bit also, that civil society is most active and listened to in democracies. That's what actually defines a democracy. The engagement of civil society, the ability of civil society to hold governments accountable is what makes civil society strong. If you look around us, you'll find that there are many, many governments who have either really not had an election, proper election, have not offered an election to their citizens in many, many years. Some have offered elections which are problematic. And some have indeed offered elections and received a claim and have been elected by a particular part of civil society. The ones who were intent enough on voting, and they may not have been the ones who actually really describe the will or the sensibility of most. So again, goes back to the point that the weakness of civil society mirrors the weakness of the governments and the weakness of the literature on this. You don't need me to, you don't need me to say that. But I think we do need to appreciate that there's such an intrinsic connection between a strong government and a strong civil society, a weak government, a weak civil society. So when then these governments come together, as Joop was saying, under the aegis of the United Nations, they come together as governments. That's the whole purpose of the United Nations. It says we the peoples. For sure, it says we the peoples, but it is actually the governments who are coming together. And each of them have their own issues with their respective civil society. You don't have to go very far. Think of this particular government in the United States of America. Think of its relationship with its civil society and civic infrastructure, and therefore think that, are they going to go to the government to speak to their own people? No, they're going to go to the United Nations to speak to other governments. They're not going to go there to have an interaction with their own civil society, and certainly not with the civil societies of others. But the UN, nevertheless, in spite of that, the UN has created, every single entity in the UN system has created multiple fora to engage with civil societies. As UN system entities, they engage with civil society, they open the doors, they have, you all know this, you've heard this also from Joop. So quite frankly, the answer to the question, Despoina, is why are governments not listening to civil societies? Why are civil societies not able to hold governments accountable? Therefore, therein is your answer to why the UN is listening or not. But remember, the UN as governments is not the same as the UN as infrastructure. The infrastructure is doing its darnest to hear and to engage and to work with civic colleagues. It's darnest, you're there, we are there. Thanks to the UN entity's willingness to create that space inside the UN system. But do the governments necessarily want to come to talk with one another about their civil society? No. They come there to talk about their own existence, their own interests, and what they need to see happen. Where those governments are democratically elected and held accountable, they are good governments. They already speak for their civil society. But where those governments are not democratically elected and not held accountable by their civil society, they speak for themselves, for the interest of that particular regime or political party. That's just the way it is.
Thank you both. And to follow on that, it sounds like one of the key points maybe for our future advocacy is also driving home the point that health of civil society participation does kind of rise all boats. It has the same ultimate ends that government does, and so that should be common ground for our work with governments. And following from that, I also want to raise a question from Margaret O'Dwyer of the Company of Daughters of Charity, which also has to do with holding governments accountable, particularly in this, at least for the time being, situation of remote participation. And Joop, maybe you'd like to begin on this since you were addressing it directly. Do you have any particular suggestions about how we as civil society, we as faith-based organizations can continue pursuing government accountability despite these remote circumstances? Any suggestions for us?
Yeah, it's not so easy. Actually, throughout the year, partly because of what I mentioned, that many NGOs can speak as in ECOSOC processes, such as the Commission for Social Development, CSW, HLPF. That part of the calendar of the year is now basically completed, and the part of the calendar that relates to the General Assembly is beginning. And most of the outcomes there, the 75th anniversary declaration, some of the main committees of the General Assembly, they just don't have the space for civil society to speak, at least not formally. If you have an NGO pass, you can sit in conference room 2 in the back, but you will never be given the floor because that's just not in our playbook. Now, of course, that makes it hard in the next few months for those of you who want to have an influence on what the second and third committee is deciding to take part. So informal lobbying will be more important now as it was last year, because I'm not expecting that in informal consultations that are held over Zoom, civil society will be invited. They were not invited to speak. I mean, you could sneak into a conference room last year, but you could not speak. But at least you could lobby and approach people, individual delegations bilaterally. Now, those of you who still have the context of last year probably be able to do that still. And of course, for those of you who have access to the Holy See delegation, that would be an option as well. And they may want to reach out to you, or you know how that works. But there are, of course, delegations that are open to listen to your voice. The second committee this year, and that's what I've been working with now, will have a number of resolutions that will basically repeat what was agreed in the previous years. And it will also have the QCPR resolution. And that's a very technical resolution that deals with the matter of how the UN organizes its assistance to developing countries. That is a resolution that's very large, has dozens of pages, and it is only once every 4 years. So what is happening in the second committee now is that most of the other resolutions are basically being reorganized in a way that they will have very little reflection, very little negotiation, in order to speed up time for that. For the third committee, I don't know really what is at the program there. There's always, of course, a number of items related to poverty and to gender, women issues, social development. So they will take place as usual, but I'm just not covering that. But the principle is the same. It will be hard to have interactions with delegations in the coming months. So for those of you who want to reach out and have a say, I would say attend as many briefings as possible, and make sure that that you have your informal contacts with the delegations or with the secretariat staff with whom you have been working with on some of the ECOSOC processes, such as CSW, the Commission for Social Development. And of course, then you can listen to everything. Passive participation is secured. Every main committee will be broadcast, but active participation, where you can actually speak, will be a bit more challenging. So, yeah, thanks.
I wonder if this would be too much of a long shot, but it just struck me as you were speaking. Could you imagine any appetite within either the second committee or any of the other committees of even, you know, this sounds silly almost in level of informality, but kind of passing around a sheet for people to say, I'm willing to be contacted by civil society who wants to have input. Just so for those, if we don't already have the right name in the right committee in the right branch, that it might be kind of an invitation or an open door for those who are willing to receive communications from civil society in this interim period.
No, it's not silly at all. The names of the bureau members of the second and third committee are public. They are various delegations, and you can write to them and say that, you know, that you're concerned that under the current circumstances, this is going to be an event that is going to be belly watching, or, you know, very introvert, very introspective, and that, you know, the work of the committee may benefit from consultations with others. And I'm sure there's a few delegations who will pick this up. I can well imagine the ones from the European Union, from Mexico, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, they would certainly, and many of these group of 77 as well. they want to engage you. So it's a good idea.
Thank you. That's a nice ray of hope. Dr. Karam, is there anything that you would like to add with regard to remote accountability? Okay. Are there any other questions or, oh yes, I see one hand from Pat Flattery and one from Beth Blissman. So we'll go to Pat first and then Beth when she's finished.
Thank you so very much. It's an honor to be in your presence and to have you respond to our statement. My question, and I think maybe we were getting into this, is a very, very practical one. Any suggestions for how we would approach the 193 member states other than the first instinct, which I guess is to send the statement to the 193 member states. But we know how many things end up in the waste paper basket or in the shredding pile. So I think we were sort of getting into this in a roundabout way, but I just wonder if you have any helpful hints for us. Thank you.
Yes, so there's two things to keep in mind here. The first is that sometimes you send a document because the act of sending it, like the act of producing it, in and of itself is extremely important. What people do with it is really not in our own hands. At a certain point, the minute you send this, you give it away, it is in God's hands, and God works through his people, so we don't know what's going to happen, but we can hope and pray for the best. I think there's a very simple way, which is to, I don't know if any of you have it's actually online as well. It's the list of all the UN missions, the missions to the United Nations. Those are every mission is composed of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs or State Department officials who are there to serve their country in the UN, at the UN. So that has the emails and the physical address of each of these missions. I personally recommend sending the emails, but not one email, sending separate emails to these different missions, or you can choose to identify the ones who are currently serving on the Security Council. You can choose to select them and say, okay, those are the guys who are ostensibly in the hot seat, the decision-making body of the UN. So you can choose to send it to their missions here in New York, with a very sort of polite letter saying we want to bring this to the, and you address it to the permanent representative, and you clarifying that letter, which by the way can be exactly the same letter used for all the permanent representatives, so it's the same template and just put the name on top. But this, saying what this is and bringing it to their attention such that they may bring it to their own capital or their Foreign Affairs State Department attention. That this is your voice as the citizens of the world, also articulating and bringing it to the citizens of the world. I strongly recommend you would do that. And I strongly recommend that you do that with not all 193, because that's a heck of a big process, but you can indeed select and focus on the ones who are on the Security Council as the main decision-making body, not just the permanent Security Council members, but everybody who's serving, all the governments serving on the Security Council at the moment. You could also choose, if you wanted, but I don't recommend, that you send it to the leadership of the Security Council, the government which is currently in charge of the Security Council, send it to the permanent representative of that with an ask that they make sure it goes to everybody else. But I wouldn't do that. Honestly, I would just send it. How many members anywhere on the Security Council? 15, 16? Yoke knows the number. I can never do numbers. It would be them 15, 16, 25? Great, 25.
15.
Better than 190.
25 you missed.
15. Even better, even better. We're doing good job haggling down the Security Council numbers. But I would do it that way, to be honest. And we've done this with other statements before. And as I said, once it's out of your hand, it's out of your hand. In the meantime, your voice has formally been communicated. And believe you me, having worked with a number of permanent representatives before, and within the diplomatic world before I came to the UN many years ago, I can tell you that there's no way that these things just get shredded, especially not when they come from religious organizations. They don't get shredded, they get very well noted. Do they respond? That's another issue. But they sure get noticed.
That's certainly another encouraging piece of information. Thank you. And I'll add for everyone's benefit that Joop has very kindly put the direct hyperlink to the directory of all the member states' missions in the chat box. So if you don't already have that in your bookmark bar, you want to go into the chat box now and save it. That is a very handy page to have on hand. And now I'll invite Beth Blissman to share her comment.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for pulling this together, and to all of you who took the lead on drafting the statement, and all of us who edited and supported along the way. And deep thanks to Dr. Karam and you for your comments today. Very, very helpful, very heartfelt, deeply appreciated. And you, when you were speaking about coming from an economics perspective, or you know, that being your background, of course, as well as Catholicism, it just had me thinking about this tradition in which I was also raised, which I actually for some years, because it no longer spoke to me in the way I thought it could, and I wasn't sure of my relationship with it, but yet I've come to embrace, again, because of the stories and the symbolism, right? We're not in it for the money, never have been. We're in it for the vision of a better world. These wonderful stories, which is my second point. We believe in miracles. We believe in lions laying down with lambs. We believe in, you know, we believe in seas parting. We believe in water turning into wine. We believe in virgin births and people raising from the dead. I mean, goodness, surely we can reform the Security Council, right? Right? Surely.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, we are here because of faith. And I love what you just said, Dr. Karam, about once we send this letter out, it's the spirit is afoot, right? It's the spirit's movement that where it goes from there. And a few practical questions for you both. And that is in terms of social media activism with this particular document. I, to be honest, never had a Twitter account before I took a position as a UN rep. I never went near Twitter. I never wanted to go near Twitter. I'd never been, I still don't do much Instagram or Snapchat or whatever that dance thing is, TikTok. But, you know, there is potential I see, especially with promoting the Sustainable Development Goals, as I look at our wonderful younger role models. I'm so deeply thrilled that there are 2 former Loreto volunteers among our number leading this charge and taking the work of our particular small, spunky, fun, feminist community into the future on our feast, one of our feast days today, Feast of the Seven Dolours, Our Lady of Sorrows. But what's your practical advice about social media? Do people pay attention? Do the member states pay attention to their Twitter accounts? Is it a great way to connect with influencers? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, if I may, apart from putting some happy family pictures on Facebook, I'm not much of an expert, but I do know that all the ambassadors have very active Twitter accounts and tweet with each other. So if you can get your account, your little tweet in between, it will probably be seen. So that is absolutely necessary. That's a very good idea. I think that would help, particularly now. Because instead of FaceTime, there's a lot of screen time now also for our delegates. So if you can get on their screen, if you can get in their face, then might as well get on their screen. So absolutely, and I'm really happy that you're employing extra staff just to look into that. It can be sometimes a little bit parochial, if you excuse my language, but I think if you want to get on their nerves, or if you want to show a product to them, I think this is really the way to go. And you will see if you go to these websites that the missions have, or if you just just search for the name of the ambassador, it's really easy to find them. I don't think it will take long to get become a friend with many of these folks. And it's certainly a very cost-effective way of engaging them, particularly when you have something interesting to say. And as a spunky group of lambs want to expose yourself to the lions of the UN. So yes, Godspeed.
Yes, I think what you could also do is exactly along those lines is once you have sent it, do a tweet which clarifies in it, by the way, how many faith-based organizations signed this amazing statement on the 275th anniversary of the UN, and then tag as many of these different mission tweets or address tweets, whatever they're called, as you can. So then it's one tweet that goes, you tag everybody that you can possibly get your hands on in it, absolutely. I wouldn't do this before you've actually sent it to these different folks in an email. I would actually recommend that you do this once you have sent it, then you tweet it and tag it out. So you give them the opportunity that they don't hear it first. Most of them will anyway, but it's more diplomatic and considerate if you do it that way. You send it and then you tweet about it. I would strongly urge that, because just knowing how the avalanche of information comes and how so many sensitivities abound about this, it's helpful if you just be considerate.
Thank you so much. Are there any last burning questions or comments that anybody in our gathering here is looking to share?
Just one thing, I just posted one other resource, the famous Blue Book. Yeah, many of you are probably familiar with it. It has first and last names, and sometimes phone numbers, and the names of the spouses even of some of the delegation, and it's public. So
focus on the permanent representative or deputy permanent representative or assistant permanent, wherever you put the name, focus on those, because it will be helpful if it goes to the top, so to speak. I forgot senior moment. There was something I really wanted to tell you and now it's gone. I'm so sorry. If I remember, I'll reach out, Teresa.
Well, you just let us know. But with that, and I have one thing to close us really, other than to say thank you both so much, you, Dr. Karam, for being with us. We have a relative amount of ease getting together as a group, thankfully. But it's all too rare that we get to interact with anyone in the UN Secretariat, especially these days, or with anyone UN adjacent, formerly of the UN, such as yourself, Dr. Karam.
Sorry.
Oh, good. I'll come back to you in 1 second. But we really appreciate your input and your perspectives, because as much as we were eager clearly in this statement to share a faith-based vision, we understand that just like anything else, it needs to be fit for purpose. And that means being able to hear your insights on how best to channel it and apply it. So we're extremely grateful for your comments and your response to all of our questions and how we can survive this next phase of advocacy. And now I'll hand it back over to Dr. Karam for her final comment.
So I just remembered something that is really, really valuable also in terms of the outreach. There is such a thing as the United Nations Interagency Task Force on engaging with religious act or religion and diplomacy. This task force has, in 2018, it created a multi-faith advisory council, which was actually nominated and elected by the UN entities themselves who are in this task force. And they nominated and elected their sort of most steadfast, trustworthy, faith-based partners, right? So, and they're all pretty much faith-based NGOs representing different religions. They work in different parts of the world and they all work on the issues. Many of your own entities are there. They work on the issues relevant to the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. So why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning it because I think you should also send it to at least to the chairs of the interagency task force and to the chairs of the Multi-Faith Advisory Council, so that they are also aware that this is something being said, because it's technically in their name. When you tweet or send it to the permanent reps, don't use the terminology FBOs. Don't use the acronym FBOs. Spell out, you are the faith-based NGOs accredited with the United Nations ECOSOC, etc. Spell it out. Don't use terminology, and don't use FBOs because they don't get it. Many of them don't know what this FBO business is, and some do, but many don't. So it's a good idea not to just reduce the acronym jargon and just speak as who you are. Very helpful. And the same thing with the tweets, by the way. Thank you.
Great. We always love the practical advice. That's excellent. We need every trick we can come across. So once again, thank you both so much for being with us. And one final thing I want to share with particularly the two of you, as you're not in our regular gatherings, is that we will be having another webinar of a similar nature, as in celebrating the faith voice and what it has to contribute at this critical point of the UN 75th anniversary. And there will be a webinar entitled Faith Speaks to UN 75. And it's going to be happening October 21st at 9 a.m. New York time. And a little far out still, so there's no registration link available yet, but if you can, we would love to have you both there and participating. And perhaps we can continue to enrich this particular discussion from there. So with that, I think I will just close us again with that very quick point of spiritual connection in 3 breaths. If you'll all indulge me for just a moment longer. Once again, let us share breath to bless our own faith traditions. Let us share a breath to bless this common space to which their unique languages, narratives, and rituals have led us. And let us take in the names and faces of all gathered here today and share a breath to bless one another and recognize our innate goodness, our personal vocations, and the unrepeatable gifts and perspectives each one brings. Thank you all so much for being here today, for participating in this conversation. It's been very rich, informative, and we have a lot of action items to work on from here. So most grateful for everyone, and have a good morning, evening, middle of the night, depending on where you're connecting from. Thanks so much.